Hello and welcome to the Reiki Women Podcast. My name is Carrie Varela with the Reiki Healing Society, and today I have the lovely privilege of having a little conversation with some of my besties. You know them, you love them too. So we got Bronwen Logan from Reiki with Bronwen. We've got Michaela Daystar from Heartscapes Reiki. And today we wanted to talk about the intersections between Reiki and psychology. And full disclaimer here, none of us are therapists or work in mental health field, have any background in mental health. But nevertheless, we kind of touched into this on a previous episode about the potential ways in which Reiki and psychology intersect, and thought it might be useful to have its own conversation, its own discussion about that particular topic. And so that's what we're going to discuss today on the Reiki Women Podcast, all about Reiki and how it fits, how it might not fit into Western medical models, including psychology. So I would love to open the conversation with one of you two beauties, Bronwen, Michaela. Who wants to talk about Reiki?
I'm happy to jump in. I do love this topic. We were just chatting before starting the recording at like many different directions this can go, and the challenges involved with having this conversation as people who are firmly in the side of Reiki and have many touch points in the worlds of therapy, psychology, but are not practicing professionals in that realm ourselves. And so I want to just start off by inviting you, dear listener, to share your own experiences. For those of you listening who are embedded in the fields of therapy, of psychology, of related fields, we would absolutely love to have you chime in and join this conversation, because I think it's a rich one. I feel really lucky and excited that we are practicing Reiki in a time when there's been really great strides made in softening the hard edge between these two worlds. I would say when I first started practicing Reiki, and even like going before that, when I first started becoming interested in, kind of wellness and, self-reflection as a means of doing work in the world. At the time, I was kind of running that up against higher education and kind of social justice work, and really feeling the hard edge between those two realms. That there was kind of this world of like doing the work out in the world and doing the research. And then there was this world of like the internal spaces and, wellness and self-reflection and creativity. And that there was this kind of the twain rarely meet when I first kind of started this interest. And just in the 20 years or so that this has been something I've been paying attention to, there's been so much softening of that line, so much more understanding. If we look at the realm of therapeutic models and practices, so much better understanding of the connection between our body, our mind, our emotional life, our spirit, and the intersections of those things, the way they interact with each other inside of our lives. Certainly the increased ability for us to kind of have more detailed brain scans and understand how trauma affects the brain, and how embodiment-based practices and meditation practices can, really are kind of the magic element for healing trauma and kind of reintegrating parts of our brain chemistry, part of our mind that get disintegrated when we experience trauma. And then over into the realm of, even just looking at, high stress jobs, realms where people's, mind and stamina and resilience really take a beating because of the work that they do, a greater understanding of the need for, just something as simple as work-life balance and self-care, and, thinking about that as integrated into our life, as opposed to something that we do only occasionally when we take a break from our life. And so I think all of those strides in, in a sense, really taking a whole person look at our lives, our work lives, our relationships, and seeing that the different elements of our life as being I mean, it seems so obvious when you think about it, but integrated in our whole self, we see this we see greater opportunities for we as Reiki practitioners to directly work alongside and perhaps even inside of the realms of therapy, of psychology and related fields. So I wanted to just kind of start with that context that like it's a really juicy time to be, in this conversation, to be a person who's interested in both sides of those things because there's more openness, there's more appreciation and understanding of the value of bringing those things together, including bringing those things into physical medical spaces. The idea of having, Reiki or other similar processes available in hospitals has become, if not normalized, at least much more common, something that is not completely out of the ordinary as it was when I first started practicing. So we have this landscape that is opening up that, really welcomes these conversations. So what does it mean to be a Reiki practitioner who's also a therapist, or a client who wants to take both of those routes in their healing journey and have those practitioners be at least aware of each other, if not collaborating with each other? I have a Reiki student who was invited to work inside of a clinic of therapists and to, sit in on their client meetings and like have conversations with them about their shared clients and kind of be on the inside of that, kind of bubble of confidentiality that is created around a therapeutic client. So, these are really juicy, interesting times, and it opens up interesting challenges and interesting, opportunities and things that kind of need to get worked through as we open up these spaces. So I think that's just kind of where I wanted to start, was a little bit of the landscape that we're stepping into with this conversation. What comes up for you, Bronwen?
I dropped my pen, so I can't live without that. Hang on a second, guys.
You are a diligent note taker. I know this about you, Bronwen. I love how you track our conversations with notes, whereas I'm just kind of like following it in my brain. So I'm glad you found a pen.
Well, otherwise I'd be saying the whole time, what was it that I thought? Because, it's sort of gone in one ear and out the other out. So anyway, yes, that was really interesting. Actually, the last thing that you just said, I thought was quite interesting about the bubble, because that bubble is something that we don't teach in the system of Reiki. We might touch on it, right? But we don't teach that, which means that we're not actually qualified. I know you've been saying that, but we haven't gone through the rigorous training that is required to create this bubble for the client. It's a different type of practice, yeah, in that sense. And we don't put across that we do create that. I mean, yes, of course, there is confidentiality, and we should be looking after our note taking and, keeping it in secure places. And there's basic rules, but that goes much deeper. And that is something that someone who is a qualified therapist will actually have spent months and months studying and working with. So I think that's something good to understand, because I there is that concern for me that a Reiki practitioner might think, oh, I can do that, And so in a class, I will always say, we're not even counselors, right? If you want to actually open your mouth and say something that might be anything in the line of counseling, you need to do at least a basic counseling course before saying anything to any client, yeah? Because that's not what we do. However, we do have the beautiful aspect of things like the Reiki precepts, which are a very mental aspect. And psychology is about mental behavior. Yeah, it's the scientific study of what is going on in our minds. And as you said, Michaela, these things are not, as far as we are concerned within the system of Reiki, we do not see these things as separate. So we don't see the mind as a separate being to other aspects of ourselves, where possibly some therapists might. But of course, there's somatic therapy, which is a more I don't know, physical type of therapy. So there are different types of therapies, which will obviously also include other things. But the very basic foundation of what I understand that psychology is that it is the science of the mind and what we do with that, so our behaviors. Which, if I think about that, there's a few different things that I sort of thought about on this subject. One is that if I think of Buddhism and Buddhist practices, Buddhism is an incredibly intellectual, on the one hand, it is an incredibly intellectual practice. And I'm not a Buddhist, but I read a lot of Buddhist stuff, and it always amazes me how incredibly technical they are about the mind. And I see a lot of parallels between psychology and Buddhism, not necessarily in what they're saying, but in taking that route to really, intricately pulling apart how we think and why we do things. And I think that's it seems to be a natural human curiosity to want to know that about ourselves. So we, I think within the system of Reiki, because it is from Japan and there is that Buddhist underpinning to the practice, I can see that there is this sort of like crossover possibly between Buddhist thought and what we're talking about today. And that is, discovering what on earth is going on up here and how does that work? Which brings me to the other thought that we were sort of talking about, that the mind is not separate, that we have, we work beautifully within the system of Reiki with this idea of Sanmitsu being body, mind, and energy or breath. So these three aspects, and that these three aspects together create us as a whole being, and that we can't have one of those aspects separate, because even if we tried, it would be, I mean, if I was just a physical body and nothing else, I would just be a physical body, which means there would be I'd probably be dead, just sort of decomposing somewhere on the side, right? So, I mean, every aspect of us works with the other aspects. And, the breath is the instigator inside this body, but where is the breath if there's no body? And then we have the mind. The mind is telling us what to do and how to do things. And, but it needs something to tell. So we can't have these things as separate elements. And I think, anyway, within the Japanese Buddhist understanding that, or Japanese, Buddhist understanding, that Sanmitsu is a way of wholeness and a way of being. So we care for all of these aspects. But when we're looking at something like psychology, yes, pulling apart the mind means that it will actually affect other aspects of us. I was just talking to, in my coaching group the other day, a student was saying that it was just telling me about the fact that someone she knew had been sick and had a heart attack through worry, and it actually has like a technical name that the doctors give it, and because they've actually acknowledged that it is the worries that we have going on in our mind are things that actually do affect our body, especially our heart. And it can, when we worry or when we have anger, when we have extreme emotions in our mind, that and I'm not talking about joyful emotions, I'm talking about emotions that we consider harmful and that our arteries restrict. And when our arteries restrict, then our heart is having obviously trouble in working and we can have a heart attack. So there's a lot of research going into this. And I find that really quite fascinating. And if we look at the system of Reiki, I just talked about, we have the Reiki precepts, which are a mental thought process and how we think and do our behaviors. So it's giving us guidelines for that. But then there's also our practices. And Joshin Kokuho. I think I just mentioned that recently, but within the word Joshin, it's purification of the heart and mind. And this linking of the heart and the mind, that these two things work together. And if we can, when we practice, what we're doing is working at purifying these, clearing these, so that we can have a more freer, a healthier body, a better well-being, live longer, all the things that we really want to be able to do in our life, enjoy our lives. So I see that the system of Reiki is very much a mental practice, but it's not alone in being just a mental practice. And so linking it into psychology, it would depend upon what a therapist would be practicing, I guess. And just before we started, Carrie was saying, therapists will often do a wide variety of different things. So, it would depend upon what they're actually doing. But they do have, as I said at the beginning, they do have some training in certain ways that we certainly don't. And that, I guess, would be probably for me the largest distinction. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's just so many different flavors of this, right? So I'd like to touch back into some of those. So first of all, I really believe that I'd love to see in my lifetime that Reiki kind of break through traditional medical models, and so that it can be incorporated with thoughtfully, ethically into medical models in a way that pays practitioners well for our time, allows insurance reimbursement, just like acupuncture has done in certain capacities, and other, complementary and alternative medicine. That's kind of a dated terms called integrative medicine. Um, and so at some point in my life, I studied medical billing, and that was kind of all with the goal to, look how yoga and Reiki could be, brought into traditional medical models, how, nurses potentially could apply Reiki for their patients, and that could, be an additional service that they offer. And then, another thing to bill within insurance companies, but also, bringing and offering accessibility and affordability of Reiki and yoga as well to patients. And like, for example, like in yoga, there's studies out there that say yoga is just as effective as physical therapy. But, in order to get that effectiveness, you kind of need to work one-to-one with a teacher, and be working more specifically oriented around a certain person's, injuries. So, so I definitely really believe that it's possible. And so there's kind of a couple of different ways to think about that. Is, first of all, how do therapists integrate Reiki into their practice, and how could they do that? And so there's all different types of therapists. There's some very woo therapists out there. And I know you, if you're a woo therapist, I love you, because you see all these different layers of who we are, right? And you are interested in learning about holistic practices that help people heal, that really provide dramatic results for people. And I think Reiki really fits that bill. So many people I know, my students and my clients who've experienced Reiki, they're just like, this has been so amazing. I recall one of my clients once, she was like, this was like 14 years of therapy. I just did 14 years of therapy in the session, and I just released so much. And there was, it was just so profound for her, right? So life-changing even. And so I think, there's a lot of different ways we can look about how you could bring that, bring Reiki into traditional psychological models and even medical models. And I also, like, there's a different, like, geeky nuance here. So, for the most part within this podcast, we talk about the system of Reiki as it's taught by Usui Sensei and some of his direct students. And so, really looking at Reiki from that lens, and also the prehistory of Reiki, the Reiki before it was Reiki, and the elements of the Japanese culture and spirituality that influenced the founder of Reiki and thereby, influenced our practice of Reiki. And then there's Hayashi. Hayashi, he's kind of an interesting dude. So I studied Jikiden Reiki, and Jikiden Reiki is very much focused on physical healing. And and that's in some part because of Hayashi Sensei. He's one of the direct students of Usui, and he had a medical background, and he really brought this whole notion of physical healing. So, and there doesn't need to be any debate about that or anything, but just to know that there is that physical healing component. Some people feel more aligned towards that, and some people feel more aligned towards this more mental and emotional work, spiritual work that Reiki can provide. And I think that's all important. So, some of the ways that we can bring Reiki to psychology is, first of all, is training therapists, people who are counselors, who are interested in learning a new system, something that would be supportive for their clients, and so I think one of the things that like I said, I'm not a therapist, but probably one of the things that is limiting to that is providing hands-on healing. So actually physically touching your client may or may not be a challenge for your, standards of practice and codes of ethics and such and so forth. So, that's what's wonderful, is to bring, Reiki through a more meditative lens, through different practices, and sharing potentially Reiki with clients, people who have trained in psychology and who want to bring Reiki into their practice. There's lots of methods with which to do so. But also to the point of what Bronwen has said and what Michaela said, is that as people who've trained in Reiki who don't have a background in psychology, we really don't, have the skills and qualifications to work with people on a counseling level. Yet, in the practice of Reiki, I know for myself, a lot of times my clients, they have problems. They want to talk about their problems. They're looking for some help. And so I always feel like what's appropriate for me to share is wisdom and insight from the practice of Reiki that might be supportive for them. So really framing it that way. I'm not a therapist, but, this is, something about Reiki that might be fruitful for you. You could work with the precepts. You can work with Joshin Kokyoho, like you talked about, some other elements that seem to be in alignment with whatever it is they're working through. That being said, I see a lot within Western forms of Reiki about offering spiritual guidance to your clients. And I feel like there's an ethical boundary there that is important to note, that, doing a Reiki training, I don't think gives you the qualifications to provide spiritual guidance. And to tell people, do this, not that, that I think to me, requires additional training. And I know, like, I have a friend who lives in my neighborhood who's she's a medical medium. I mean, she is psychic for all intents and purposes and can do amazing things, has amazing insight, but she has a background in psychology. And it's really from that she can offer the guidance and the support that she offers. And so if, providing spiritual guidance is part of your practice, I definitely think it's really important to study some sort of, counseling, get additional training so that you can really work with some of the power dynamics that can come into place there. There's a lot of touchy subjects within that realm. So, and then I think another level of this, but nevertheless, I think Reiki practitioners are great supports for counselors. So counselors are taking in so much of people's pain and, hard things that they've gone through in their life. And that has to have an emotional impact on us. And so finding something that helps therapists work through their own emotions, create stronger energetic boundaries, be able to kind of wash away some of the stuff that's, that they nevertheless sit in with their clients, but isn't theirs really to hold. And I can only imagine, I'm a very empathic person. I would have a hard time with that, if I was a counselor and was really listening. So I think, that counselors can really receive a lot of support from practices of Reiki. And so there might be just a healthy revolving door between Reiki practitioners and psychologists. And I've already seen it. I'd love to see more of it, Reiki practitioners going into counselor's office, offering Reiki as just a supportive service for counselors who are, dealing with a lot and have a high stress job. And, however it is, feels aligned for psychologists also to bring this medicine of Reiki to their patients. I'd love to see it, blossom and more growth happen in this area for sure.
Yeah. This is really such an important place to apply the principle of being both firm and flexible, right? Because I think that, a lot of those hard boundaries that, I talked about earlier, they develop for a lot of reasons, some of which are financial and, structural, let's fit everything into a mechanized structure where you've got everything siloed and, there's that side of things. But there are also good reasons, especially in the realms we're talking about now, to have some boundaries between what people are, allowed to do when it comes to vulnerable populations. At the same time, if we have no flexibility in that, then we lose access to incredible resources, as you're speaking to, Carrie. And so, this idea that, and I've seen like in the big boom in the fields of coaching and counseling as alternatives or as a slightly different wheelhouse from therapy and psychology, where a person can get training that allows one to have structures to walk a person through mindset coaching, right, and ways of fine tuning their thoughts and feelings and therefore their behaviors around stuff that they're struggling with that isn't formal therapy and therefore has, more flexibility in how it can be offered. I have colleagues who have created Reiki coaching programs to teach you that's a combination of a coaching program, right? Here's systems and structures and strategies and methods that have been proven to be effective in working with people around their mindsets and their feelings and their behaviors. And here's Reiki, and let's bring that together. And so, this flexibility that's coming in alongside of respecting structures and respecting that there are reasons for there to be certain boundaries around certain practices, I think is really exciting. A person who is a really powerful and valuable teacher to look to on this is David Treleaven. He is a therapist and also a mindfulness meditation coach and practitioner. And so he was one of the people that I studied when putting together my trauma-informed Reiki class, because he's done a lot of work in trauma-informed mindfulness meditation. And one of the things that he really brings to the forefront is that, looking from the perspective of a therapist at the way that mindfulness meditation is often taught in a Western context, where it's been divorced from its Buddhist origins and from, the structures that would normally contain the practice of mindfulness meditation. We in the West have taken mindfulness meditation out of those structures, put it as a standalone practice. We've kind of secularized it, taken the spiritual teachings out of it, ignored the fact that mindfulness meditation is a peak practice. It's not an entry-level practice. It's something you work yourself up to. And so what Treleaven noticed is that there was, a certain percentage of people in the practice of mindfulness mindfulness meditation that would experience, forms of psychosis, that would experience the triggering of deep traumas, that would experience, great distress, mental, emotional distress when in the practice of mindfulness meditation, and that those mindfulness meditation teachers were not equipped to understand what was happening for those clients and to coach them through it. And so they would end up in therapy because they're having psychosis experiences and trauma triggering and all of these things in a practice that is supposed to calm their stress, that is supposed to, have them feeling more relaxed in their life. And so it's, reading his work and studying his practices, and really respecting that he's not saying, so therefore we should not teach people mindfulness meditation, or mindfulness meditation should only be done by therapists. He's saying those who are going to lead people in these practices would be well informed to have some basis for what's happening in the psychology of a person's mind who's experienced trauma, and to recognize the signs of somebody who's experiencing distress or psychosis or triggering. And better yet, to have structures and systems and protocols in place that everybody experiences who comes into that practice, that helps to mitigate those experiences. And so that's where trauma-informed mindfulness meditation and trauma-informed yoga practice were born, right? Is like, let's put a little bit of structure around these, spiritual practices, mental, emotional practices that, let's be honest, in a Western context are often distributed and practiced in a fairly loosey-goosey sort of way, right? You can, pick it up and teach it and pass it along to other people quite readily, with very little standardization in what a person is required to know and to be trained to do. Yoga has much more structure around it. And I think that that's because it's a physical practice, right? There's more of an understanding going in that, people can get hurt doing this practice, right? People can, strain a muscle and throw their back out and, get their knees messed up, right? Doing yoga in a way that's not skillfully taught. And so, pretty early on, yoga developed structures around it so that there's standardized ways in which it's taught. And then trauma-informed yoga coming in more recently to add this layer in of like, hey, there's vulnerability in this practice. There's intimacy in this practice. There's the way in which the things stored in our body can get stirred up and generate mental, emotional experiences that are unanticipated in a yoga class. And the yoga teacher, who maybe is just there to help people have an exercise experience or have a good stretch or, whatever it is, needs to be equipped to account for those things. And so, we've got a lot of good models for bringing together the structures that are associated with things like yoga, things like coaching and counseling, and even therapy, and bringing that alongside our Reiki practice so that we have a little bit more structure. And then, the thing that both of you have named, we as Reiki practitioners and those who teach us and kind of hold us accountable, just being super clear about what our qualifications are and are not in the realm of therapizing a person, right? In the spaces that we create. And, again, that line can get really flexible. It can get really blurry, right? A person is, often, a Reiki client will come in and disclose all kinds of personal information, right? Like right off the bat, like, I have just met you. We have not, had a working relationship. You've never had a Reiki session before. But, there's something about the space. And oftentimes, people are like coming because they're like, I really need help. They're often going to disclose quite a bit of personal information. And how we hold and receive that personal information, what we do with it, to what degree we believe that we're entitled to then take that information and create, some form of dialogue with them or, therapeutic practices with them, is a ethical concern. And it's something that, you know, as both of you have said, we would do well to acknowledge if that's something we desire to do with people, right? If we feel we maybe have a capacity or an inclination, or it's just like, this is what people seem to want, and so I want to be able to meet them in that, that we seek out some form of training that has to do with that side of things beyond our Reiki training. And again, you know, we live in a really juicy time. There are many, many ways that we can get that augmented level of support as practitioners. And the last thing I'll say about that is that this is a realm where having systems of support amongst each other is incredibly important. You hinted on this, Carrie, with even like Reiki practitioners supporting therapists in their circle of support for doing their work. We should not be doing this kind of work in isolation. And the internet gives us ample opportunity to be in community with each other, to build spaces of support and accountability and troubleshooting, where we can, you know, put in structures of confidentiality and you know, respect and all of that that is important when we're working with clients' private information, personal information. And, you know, our own need to be in a space of groundedness and wellness in that. And, you know, we're not saying any of this to be like, yeah, I hope that this is coming across as focusing on potential and possibility and opportunity, not just on like, be warned, be afraid, you know, like that's not what we're up to here. And we do want to emphasize the importance of really acknowledging where our capacities are and where we could use additional support in that, especially if we want to step into anything that looks like counseling or therapy. And if we do have that desire, it's a juicy, juicy place to be. It truly is.
Yeah. Well, where to go with all of that? I mean, you know, I thought that was a really interesting discussion, Michaela. And yes, you know, we do all need support. I've had years and years of therapy. That's some support. But it's great, you know, it's this learning about yourself, learning about, you know, yourself from a mental perspective. And, you know, that informs everything else as well. So that's really helpful. I noticed that a lot of people who come for Reiki treatments or courses actually come because they're referred by other people, not necessarily Reiki practitioners, but, you know, from counselors or, you know, just places where they've gone to for help. And those people have used, I like the word therapize. Is that a real word? Therapize? Whatever you were saying. Yeah, that anyway. So should be. And so people, you know, who have gone through those sorts of processes, and someone has said to them, you know, moving into a different sort of space with what you're going through can be helpful. Something like the system of Reiki, where we have practices like meditation practices, which are very much about going inside. So it's different from going outside and trying to get help from someone. This is about going inside and trying to develop your strength inside and finding help within. So it's a different form and something that's incredibly powerful and important in our lives. And then, you know, the other aspects, as we've sort of already mentioned, there's, you know, the precepts and hands-on healing, being touched by someone, and the, you know, how impactful that can be in a safe environment, and letting go into that healing space with somebody else. So the system of Reiki certainly has, I feel, a lot to offer people. Yes, it's not psychology, but it certainly links in some aspects, and definitely, like I was just saying, people who are therapists will refer through to us. Something that I did notice recently was someone was telling me about, they did a course about getting the system of Reiki into hospitals, which is a wonderful, you know, thing, because it's a bit of a it's a different take on how we think of our well-being, instead of it being so medicalized. But it seemed to me that what was happening in this particular instance, that Reiki was being medicalized. And I'm not sure I totally agreed with a lot of the things that was being said about the system of Reiki to try to sell it to hospitals, right? So, there was this sort of thing about, oh no, when I do a Reiki treatment, the only effect is a positive one, and the person always feels good afterwards. I mean, yes, it's good to set your client up for a healthy experience and something that is going to be beneficial, but to prescribe to someone what they're going to feel and how they're going to feel it, to me that is restrictive and isn't really at any point my way of working with the system of Reiki. So I think that's something to think about too. How do we move into these worlds and be a part of these worlds? Because sometimes we feel pressured to say or do things that might not actually be in line with the actual teachings. And we're not a medical system. Yeah.
I also found all of that quite interesting. I kind of lost my whole train of thought of what I was going to say. But
I lost my pen again. Anyway, it's gone.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all just really important food for thought, this is what I was going to say that I think might be a helpful thing to end on, unless we have some other thoughts. But I have a associate, a friend who is a therapist, and then but has kind of dealt or she has kind of gone her own way, like maybe a little bit outside of some of the traditional therapy roles. And she really felt like Reiki and hypnosis and some other aspects of healing was really profound for her own healing, because it went beyond this talk therapy. So, talk therapy is working more with our conscious mind. And so working with Reiki has a potential to get down into our subconscious mind and our unconscious mind. So kind of reworking patterns, trauma from a subconscious place as well. And also from a spiritual place. I think that's the other aspect we haven't really woven in, is that, there's a spiritual aspect of Reiki that, again, in Western models of health often is, excluded, right, from that. But maybe not always, and not always intentionally, but some people, it's just not within the context, right? So that is a place where it is hard to bring Reiki into, or to fit and conform Reiki into a practice that makes sense to a Western medical practice. But nevertheless, just this whole notion is just a really helpful conversation to have, right? It's like, how does Reiki help us? Understanding that, how could we, use the practice of Reiki to support our own mental health, and also, work with clients in the context of Reiki and psychology, if you have a psychology background. I also think, some of the meditations and just taking those mindfulness moments, before a therapy session begins is so important. I've done a lot of therapy myself. And sometimes if you just kind of come in and just, it's like this verbal, like, blah, and maybe that's what needs to happen. But sometimes that also just perpetuating an anxious feeling. So helping clients kind of settle into their body, settle into their breath, and then kind of engaging with a conscious dialogue from that place. So there's probably many places of intersection and points where, it's challenging to bring two things together. And I think that is just the way of Reiki. If we integrate Reiki into different modalities, different healing modalities, different systems. So I know that has been something that I've really, had to juggle, being a Reiki practitioner and a yoga teacher. And so we hope this conversation was useful to you, those of you who are listening. Michaela, Bronwen, any final thoughts?
Nope.
No, This feels really complete.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I know within the Reiki Healing Society community, there's a lot of people who are therapists who are really interested in learning how they can bring Reiki more into their practices. And so if you're that person, feel free to connect with me, and feel free, of course, also to share your experiences with us, and forward on this conversation to somebody who you might think could benefit from it. And thank you all so, so much for listening. And we can't wait to have another little conversation with you coming soon. So have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.